Joshi became the new General Secretary. He thus became the first General Secretary of the Communist Party of India. And at that time, the left movement was steadily growing, and the British government banned communist activities. In February 1938, when the Communist Party of India started in Bombay, its first legal organ, the National Front, Joshi became its editor. This lecture is titled Marx and the Economics of Wisdom and will be delivered by Professor John Joseph Boillot. This lecture will be chaired by Ajit Sinha, Professor Azim Premji University, Bangalore. I request the speaker to please go ahead and the chair to take over the proceedings.
Okay, this is not working. Is it working? No, it's not working. It's working now? Okay. Well, welcome to the 35th PC Joshi Memorial Lecture. Since Jean has been introduced already, I think, twice, I don't think he needs another introduction from me. However, it's a pleasure to be chairing Jean's session because we go together a long way. I came to know Jean when he was working in French. You were working in the French embassy at that time, yeah. And so it's been about maybe 2 decades or something like that. And I remember in Paris, Jean was very generous, invited me to his house for lunch. And I have very pleasant memories of that lunch, but Jean doesn't remember anymore. Okay, Jean, go ahead. We save some time. And Jean will speak for 30 minutes, and after that, I hope we'll have time for good questions.
On agility of mind, even on good and strong theoretical grounds, I won't say that I would be able to be as lively as been, but it's quite similar from a different angle to what I want to say. Okay, so Samsung start, countdown. Yeah, let's go. So I'm working on research based on utopia. I still believe that we need utopia for the 21st century. But the question is, if you look back at the 19th century, we got plenty of utopia, isn't it? The 19th century is the century of utopia. And if you are serious, you can see that all failed. Not only the Marxist utopia, but also the liberal utopia. That's what I want to make sure. We have to keep the balance between the two major utopia of the 19th century. Okay, today I will mostly address the Marx utopia and try to get out of this stupid démarche, which is to discuss whether or not Marx wrote this or wrote that. Maybe it's of interest, like when I read the Bible, there's always something true and something wrong. No, what I'm interested in is to look forward. What are the solutions? What can we draw from Marx's experience? I'm not talking about Marxism as such, because it doesn't exist. There are hundreds of schools. I was myself started with the Communist Party of France, and then I went to the Maoists, then joined the Trotskyists. All were Marxist. Now, I decided that I'm not anymore a Marxist. I am a human being. I am a scientist. I want to understand the world as a free man, taking the best of the knowledge which has been accumulated, including, for sure, Marx. He was one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. Definitely, definitely. Now, when we talk about Marx, we talk about three different Marx, at least, and five great theses of the original Marxism of Marx. I'm referring to my Bible, the Manifesto, which remain the core books of Marx doctrine. You can just read at the preface. He wrote in 1988 a new preface and always referred to the Manifesto as its operus, its book, its Grundrisse in German they say, no? So what are the three Marx? First, we had the philosopher, isn't it? He started as a philosopher. And just I want to say that, to keep in short, Marx was in opposition to metaphysics and idealism, isn't it? With the central concept of materialism. That is clear. And dialectic materialism, which interpret the entire history of societies and of the world to that of the form of production, mode of production, of the form of production, from which social classes and class struggle derived as the driving force of history. This largely explained the central place given by Marx to the economy in explaining the evolution of societies. Well, I strongly disagree with this approach. Why? Without denying the importance of production relations and material life in the determination of social relations of individuals, the mechanistic vision of the determination of this superstructure by material infrastructure seems not only simplistic, but strongly reductionist, to the point that Marx himself was obliged to broaden his theoretical framework to analyze concrete situations, like in this excellent book, Les luttes de classe en France. That's a book you need to read, because Marx used such a different analytical framework compared to the simplistic materialism dialectic. Or for the treatment of the caste system in India. We have discussed a little bit about that, not enough. In his correspondence with Engels, he also made numerous references to the concept of the Asiatic mode of production, or despotism, Eastern despotism, in an attempt to understand the Eastern countries. The problem is that the Eastern countries at that time did represent 2/3 at least of the humanity. So what it means is that the Marx apparatus was not able to explain the major part of the world. That's for after. Now, let's go to the aspect of Marx as a philosopher, economist and political scientist. He is much better known. In these two fields, Marx's essential ideas can be summarized with 5 theses, as suggested by an excellent book for me, is Eric Olin Wright, Envisioning Real Utopias. That's an excellent book for me. I will not take time to bore you with these 5 theses, but this is important. This is a core of Marx's theory. Thesis number 1, the long-term unsustainability of capitalism under the effect of its own internal contradiction. And that you can read from the beginning till the end of the life of Marx. Well, where are we today? Still capitalism is there, is maybe even in a much better shape than it was during the 19th century. So something may be wrong with these theses. We have to understand. I'm not interested to say that Marx was wrong. The question is, why and how it was wrong. Now, thesis number 2, the intensification of the anti-capitalist class struggle by increasing proletarization of the entire world population. Well, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with this thesis. Not only because I live in Europe, where I'm looking for the proletariat. It does exist, but it's not 100% of the population by far. There's a proletariat in Europe, but maybe 10 to 15% of the population in the true sense of Marx. But also in the world at large. I'm traveling in India. Okay, you have proletariat, but we are not seeing this shift to an entire population going to proletarianization, as it was excellently demonstrated this morning. We have a very strange economy in India, but it is not corresponding to the Marx ideas. So to speak, what about China? What about China? Can we say that in China we have the huge, I do believe that China is following capitalist system. Clearly, there's no point, sorry. I would love this lecture before, but market socialism or capitalism, I don't see much difference as far as China is concerned. But can we say that the Chinese entire population has joined the proletariat? Go to China and you will see. There's a huge middle class, huge one. And if there is a proletariat for sure, still maybe it represents 10, 15, 20% of the population. Now, thesis number 3, that is true. Every books, every comments of Marx say there is ineluctability of the revolutionary transformation following the thesis 1, thesis 2. So what about this ineluctable revolutionary transformation? Where are we today? I don't need to elaborate on that. Okay? Thesis number 4, the transition to socialism. It means a production system based on collective ownership and controlled by democratic and egalitarian institutions. Where do you see socialism today? Not in China, nor for sure in Soviet Union. I spent 4 years there. It was just the nomenclatura who took the power, isn't it? And enjoy, the benefit of the economic and social system. Now, thesis number 5, the advent of communism under the double dynamic of the reinforcement of community solidarity and the erosion of capitalism. Now, of inequality, sorry. We still look for communism, isn't it? 200 years, this is a 200 years, birthday ceremony. We are looking for communism. So we should ask ourselves, why do we fail in the socialist transition and to establish this kind of communism? Now, my explanation is like that. This is what I want to explain, no? First, because there is a confusion between science and ideology, and between utopia, we went to dystopia. This is mainly my demonstration. I'm an economist, but as an economist, I want to deal with real life, and real life deal with ideology. Market ideology as well as socialist ideology. Now, despite this harsh observation on the Marx 5 thesis, sorry, useful to have a paper sometimes. No one can deny that Marx was one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. I say the greatest, one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. His critical work on the capitalist mode of production at a key moment when it would assert itself as the dominant economic system in Western countries and beyond extending to the entire planet has proved essential keys to understand the economic, social, and political mechanism of that system. Could not ask Ricardo, Smith, etc., because they were just showing the positive aspect of the capitalism. Only the Marxists, as such, as a whole, were really providing that critique of the system. But here, there's an essential distinction made by a great philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, between science and ideology, and between utopia and dystopia. So as for Marx between science and ideology, I want to talk about two things. First, the manifesto of the Communist Party turned Marx into ideology, and it disappeared as a scientist. That, clearly, you can read not only the manifesto, but you take the manifesto, the main thesis of the manifesto, and then you read all the works of Marx, they are derived from the manifesto. This is why he can write the preface in 1980, in 1990, saying that still it remains my deep conviction. So why is it important to talk about ideology? Ideology intervenes because no system of domination governed by force alone. Each system of domination requires not only physical submission, but also consent and cooperation. Or in other terms, a kind of legitimacy, whose ideology provides the codes of interpretation that ensure the integration of individuals by justifying the present system or the alternative system. And this is why Marx had to go from a scientific approach to an ideological approach. This approach is essential to understand how Marx moved from a critic that he wished to be as rational as possible to an ideology that aimed to produce a legitimation of his alternative vision of capitalism. However, this work was in 1847. He was writing in 1847, when Marx was not yet 30 years. And it had obviously influenced all his subsequent work, which ultimately aimed more at supporting his political and ideological approach than being purely a scientific work. Second aspect may be very important. Did Marx's ideology impose itself by its scientific or rational relevance? Not at all. Why? This alternative ideology was actually competing with a whole range of other ideologies, not only the pro-capitalist ideologies, but also the alternative ideologies, like other socialist movements. There were plenty, like anarchism, which were at the time much more important in France than the communists. But history will remember that it is the Marxist communist parties which gradually impose themselves as the dominant force in the anti-capitalist elite. They undoubtedly succeeded thanks to the intellectual power of Marx. But, more so, thanks to the organizational strengths of the Marxist communist movement, resulting from Marx's theory of revolution, led by an avant-garde party, organized in an almost military manner, Lenin with his Bolshevik party, but also Mao with his political and military works. We should read that, Mao. It remains also a very interesting source of knowledge. would develop this theory of the revolution of the so-called proletarian avant-garde party with a practical success we know. In this sense, Marx's ideology will become hegemonic for a very long period within the anti-capitalist movement, less because of its scientific basis, but because of the praxis and success to seize the power. From this comes probably also the importance of the communist utopia. The ideology, utopia. Look how. During Marx's life, why? Sorry. It played a major role, this utopia, in the revolution in Russia, in China, in Africa. And why? Because between ideology and utopia, there is a very, very close similarity. According to the same philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, a social imaginary function capable of mobilizing human energy and passions, but where ideology has the function of legitimizing the authority or justifying the authority, utopia has the function of stimulating the imagination on the field of possibilities beyond the existing by making possible to envisage radically different way of living without worrying about the feasibility. In this sense, Marx's communist utopia play an essential role in bringing together mass of people and intellectuals who did not share the communist either praxis or theory, but who accepted it for its practical effectiveness when fighting with the capitalism, in overthrowing capitalist regime, and because of their dream of another society. That's play in Europe, that's play in Russia, when you read all the books about how the mass were supporting the Bolshevik to a certain extent, because there was a dream. When you read about Mao and China, 90% of the Chinese were not supporting the theory, but were supporting the dream for another society. And at that time, the Communist Party were hegemonic in action, and they won against the other alternative system. Now, utopia. That's good. Utopia. Check. Yeah. There's a long story of utopia, and we have not talked too much on the utopia, which is stupid because it's, in the end, the raison d'être of Marx. The communist utopia was the raison d'être of Marx. You can read the Manifesto. Clear. Now, from utopia to dystopia, what happened to that utopia? I defined already utopia. So, since the Greek, you can find utopia in every continent, every literature. For instance, we had Homer in Odyssey. There's a wonderful passage about the ideal society. But also I was talking about China. You can find in China also. You know, Confucianism can be defined as an utopia, a perfect world. And everywhere you had utopia. But nevertheless, for Europe, the breaking point is Thomas More's work, whose title is Utopia. And this is from that Thomas More book that derives the word utopia. But I want to jump into the 19th century. From Thomas More, you get more than 500 books dealing with vision of a a perfect world. So utopia started to influence the Enlightenment philosopher on a very strong way, Voltaire, etc. However, Marx never almost mentioned that historical books. Very little, he never quoted Thomas More, Mably, Morelli, Cabet, Vilgardel, etc. Why is it very important? Because if he had done so, he would have seen that the actual system in these books were following a totalitarian system regime. You had in the Thomas More reading a clear vision of, on one hand, it's a wonderful dream, equalitarian society, there is affluence, etc. But if you look at the system, economic system and the political system is a totalitarian state. You cannot, as an individual, escape from this social control. Now, instead of that, Marx and Engels spend so much time criticizing the socialist, the so-called utopian socialist. Owen, Fourier, Proudhon. And if you read that, you have one full chapter treating these socialist alternatives as reactionary bourgeois. So the communist movement started to reject all the alternatives to capitalism, which were not communist as such. Now, I will not go in details, but if you look at what happened with this communist hegemony, we got Russia, and we got actually the animal farm model, what I call the animal farm model. This is one of the best books. I think you should spend more time in reading that than in reading that. It's George Orwell. He published 1984, which is also a wonderful book to understand how totalitarian, the modern totalitarian regimes are coming. And it applied clearly to, let's say, the Russian experience, etc. Maybe to Nepal, but I don't think so. The end will end. But the model behind, the economic and political model behind, is clearly the outcome of Marx's vision of that utopia. He has not elaborated on the main question for us, not critique of capitalism, but what is the alternative of capitalism? There is no, actually, positive contribution of Marx to what is the alternative. And the way Marx dream about utopia brought about this dystopia. You understand? Utopia is the best word, and dystopia is that utopia turned into a cauchemar. Now, what about China today? That's very interesting, because the mass is not said. My prognosis is that China is evolving to that dystopia, described in a very detailed manner by Aldous Huxley, with a very interesting economic model behind. I hope you have read Aldous Huxley. It's the best vision of that kind of modern civilization, being capitalist or being socialist. And I think that the Chinese regime is clearly on that path. It has succeeded to escape from the totalitarian of Stalin model, but is shifting to this Aldous Huxley, with the one party commanding all the system, except that he need to provide to the population economic result in order to legitimize his vision of everything except freedom. That's Aldous Huxley, totalitarian state at the modern age. Since I have to finish, I want to open what beyond, what conclusion I draw from that. That I call economics of wisdom. Still in the social sciences, wisdom is not at the command. We always try to oppose one model against the other one, etc. But actually, what happened? Most of the time, it's a combination of. Why should I oppose Adam Smith to Keynes, to Marx? The real life is made of what Indians call masala. Masala. Masala is a mix of. And in the case of Marx, there are plenty of interesting things. The Sraffa critique, for instance, is excellent. But why should join a camp? Being a Sraffist or no? So 3 recommendations for me, for us. First of all, there is a human nature. There are realities of human nature. And there is not only this mode of production. There is not only institutions. The real nature, if you want to catch a glimpse of that, you read Panchatantra. It's a base book about the real human nature. It's made of chacal, lion, etc., etc. They are animals, but a very top economist, Danny Rodrik, has mentioned that the fables are actually more performing better than the economic textbook, because they take the life, the real life, as granted. And if you read the Panchatantra, it's wonderful because the fables are integrated, but there is no conclusion. Sharma doesn't try to say this is the solution. There is no solution, actually, because you will get always good guy, bad guy, etc., etc. So we have to deal with this human nature. Someone was mentioning the prisoner dilemma. Actually, economics is shifting to that with the game theory, etc., etc. We got Nobel Prize, who shifted from the stupid Homo economicus hypothesis into a much more realistic one, based on the psychology of the people. But what the problem with these people, they try to close the human nature into a rational guy to a certain extent. Now, institutions are always imperfect. That should be the golden rule number 1. You cannot solve with a good economic system or with so-called good institutions, because institutions are bad by themselves, but they are necessary. Yes, I finish. Last not least, and this is why I want to refer to Danny Rodrik and my best guy on social sciences, Albert Hirschman, which I touched upon last year already. What I love with these 2 figures, and Danny Rodrik is a Marxist to a certain extent, no? Last book of Danny Rodrik is about economic rules. What he says clearly like that. You have economic rules, but in a very narrow sense. You should not try to build up a big model. We try to explain everything. And that was Marx. He wanted to explain everything with his model. Like so many people spend decades with Keynes. Same. To describe the Keynesian model of. And they were happy because after the war we got a very good economic growth. And then Keynesian system derailed and nobody knows what to do nowadays. Now, economic models and limited rationality. Why limited rationality? It's because when you're an economist, you use a specific model, you find out a solution to that problem. But once you get this result, as Hirschman say, trespassing. This solution shifts from economics to sociology, or to social questions. Then the sociologist come, built his own model, and want to conclude. But when he concludes, the social problems shift to politics, and then shift to cultural, etc., etc. Human beings are, yes, thank you. Human beings are complex, okay? So no science can be applied or can explain to understand perfectly the comprehension of the world. So we need, this is why I was saying, we need to be very prudent, wise. The definition of wisdom, we are wise, we are prudent, we never conclude as such. We are always looking at the conclusion, and then whether or not it applies, we test that conclusion. This is why Hirschman was a very interesting guy. Instead of being a Marxist as such, he was in favor of macro-Marxism, which means the implementation of these ideas at the local level, and check the result, see whether or not it works. Thank you for your attention. I try to keep with the time.
Thank you.
But I want to add something.
Later.
Utopia can be realized under three conditions, apart from what I've said on science. That three conditions are: A, you need ethics. You need ethics. Marx had no ethics in this system. Number two, you need non-violence. You need non-violence. This is the end and means model. If you use violence, you will get violence in your system. And three, you need to respect nature. Not only human, but nature. Why? Because human beings are living in the same planet as the nature. So, provided you follow the three principles, which are close to Gandhi to a certain extent, and to someone which was never referred by Marx, John Ruskin. John Ruskin. Everybody forgot about John Ruskin, and in the US, they were an alternative movement, what is called today degrowth. Degrowth. They are anti the growth. But John Ruskin was so important that, unto the last, described an alternative system which influenced a lot Gandhi, but also a lot of other thinkers. And just what I hope that the Marxists, which I respect a lot, will come back on the scene and open their vision with all these alternative schools. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for a wonderful presentation, but you have eaten 5 minutes of your own question time.
Yes.
Okay, so, it's open. Please be brief in your comments, or I know there will be plenty of hands. Please be brief in your comments or questions, because we have only 5 minutes.
Hello. Sir, you mentioned, first of all, thanks for a very wonderful lecture. You talked about utopia. Every political episode, be it the 1917 revolution in Russia or the Maoist revolution in 1949, all these revolutions, all these utopias had a context. Before 1949 in China, we know what US did to China. In Russia, we had the Romanovs for 300 years. So these utopias were in a way built to galvanize those masses for a larger purpose. Number one. Number two, you say that China is moving into a dystopia. In that case, will that be a failure of capitalism in China or communism in China? Because China has a communist political system and a capitalist economic system. Third.
No, keep
Sir,
it to let other people also ask.
A quick one, sir. Thank you. Walt Rostow wrote the Capitalist Manifesto in 1960. Rostow, the Rostow model of development. He wrote a book called The Capitalist Manifesto in 1960, if I remember correctly. Most of us who believe in market economy or capitalism also tend to build this utopia into the system. So it is not always the Marxist or the communists who should be accused of building utopias, creating utopias. We capitalists, or many of us who support market economies, too tend to build those utopias into the system. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for a very insightful lecture. Just a simple question. What is your understanding of Cuba? Just if you can shed some light on that. Thank you.
Okay,
as you have said in your lecture that we don't differentiate between market socialism and capitalism. My question to you is that in China, the land is in state hands or in the collective farms. and it's an important feature of capitalism that the land ownership should be in private hands. Is it proper to say China a capitalist country when the land is still in state hands? I would like to know your response.
I enjoyed your discussion of utopia and dystopia at the fag end of this conference when I think our brains were kind of getting inevitably jammed. Now, when you refer to Aldous Huxley, I presume you were referring to Brave New World.
Yeah, Brave New World.
Which is a kind of satire, if you like, of what the state can become. And combined with genetic engineering, you get a wonderful imaginary combination of racism and capitalism, if you think about the alpha, beta, delta groups. Now, Huxley had another novel called Island, which also paints a kind of utopia. It's not as structured and totalitarian as Brave New World, but it is one where, you know, people are in unison, they listen to the Brandenburg Concerto, they talk about the Bhagavad Gita, and this wonderful world goes on until suddenly one morning an oil ship arrives. What were you trying to imply, that all utopias would end up in that way?
Yeah. Okay, see, we cannot take any more questions. You are raising your hand too late. We have a Skype meeting, Skype talk at 5:30 sharp. So Jean, just 2 minutes you have, okay?
Yeah, I wanted to trigger discussion and reflection now, so I'm always a bit provocative. I hope that at least the framework I put on the table will be helpful for you. About China, you know, that stupid dichotomy between he's a capitalist or he's not a capitalist led to that kind of talk where he tried to convince everybody in that room that there is a market socialism and a market capitalism. You have as many capitalism as you have countries. France is not a pure capitalism. It's a very French capitalism. Germany is a very German capitalism. And I never seen a country with 100% of the economy being capitalist. We had an excellent speech about India. Is India a capitalist country? No. So capitalism is just a kind of mechanism which have some weight, some role, some place at the world level, but not only being capitalist. So we have cooperative today. 20% of the French economy is under the regime of cooperative, which means the non-profit organization, etc., etc. Maybe the most capitalist in the true sense can be the US, but as you know, since that excellent reading of Polanyi, the book of Polanyi, that kind of capitalism cannot exist just because there is a Protestantism ethic behind. No, it's not Polanyi, it's Weber. So about China, forget. The land belongs to the state, clearly. It is just a state capitalism, and maybe it's the more Orwellian country today, I can tell you, because one of my daughters lives there, you are under surveillance in a much, much more totalitarian situation compared to the US, where, God, the freedom are not the best. And it was just Cuba. Cuba is animal farm, like Nepal, except that the animal farm is a model, and the reality never stick to the model. So it's a variant of the model, but if you have been to Cuba, you can see that a very strange country. You cannot say that it's happiness everywhere, that the economic system is efficient, etc. You got exactly what that stupid guy, George Orwell, described in 1913. So what I hope at least is that we will be able, because we are convinced that the capitalist system has pathology, that we know. Okay?
Thanks.
We absolutely agree on that. So just what I hope that from the utopia you have, and we all need utopia, then you come back to ideology, because we need ideology. Forget about ideology is not bad by itself. But that ideology has to be very pragmatic and based on rational science.
Thank
That's
you.
what we need.
Thanks, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. We finished.
Thanks. I was... No. We need to...
Thank you, Professor Boillot and Professor Sinha.